I am Rachel Lane, and this is my client progress presentation. So, an overview of my client and intervention is as follows. So, for my client, there are two members of the school social work team that I am conducting my research on. Both are cisgender and female. Both are in their early 30s. One is of Southeast Asian descent, while the other is white. Both have their masters within social work. One covers the middle school and one is in elementary or primary and covers those two branches of our school. In this point about equal opportunity to apply skills learned, that is speaking to why I chose to conduct the research on both of our social workers in order to provide them with equal opportunities to implement restorative practices within our schools, as opposed to limiting it to one social worker and not allowing the other social worker to be a part of it. As for the intervention is a guidebook that was created by me and was influenced by research regarding how to implement restorative practices, what restorative practices are, and considerations, materials, and resources on how to implement those practices. So the guidebook is on 5 restorative justice practices with resources on how to implement each practice and 4 sessions to discuss questions and how to apply each practice. And those sessions would occur during our prep times in the school day. And if we're not able to do it during that prep time, then a virtual discussion would be conducted. Including in the intervention is a baseline test collected pre-intervention, and that is a quantitative 5-point Likert scale format with options of very comfortable, extremely comfortable, or somewhat. So it's the 5-point Likert scale of like extremely, somewhat, neutral, somewhat, extremely, whether that is um, extremely uncomfortable or extremely comfortable, which we'll get further into. Um, the intervention itself of the guidebook and the sessions discussing the guidebook is applied over the span of 2.5 weeks, and the same baseline form sent out before the intervention is sent out after the intervention application, so after it's been applied, to then be able to compare and contrast what improvements have been made. The goal is to see notable increase in social work familiarity and comfortability with implementing each of the restorative practices that are listed in the guidebook. So the stated progress of the client. So we have completed 1.5 weeks of the intervention so far, so we are just over halfway. Both social workers have verbally stated the benefits of having the guidebook as a toolkit for addressing conflicts that have occurred over this past week. Initially, the half week of the intervention occurred over spring break. And so during that time, the social workers were only able to interact with the guidebook, and we hadn't conducted any of our discussion sessions yet. However, over the last week, we've been able to do that. One of the social workers also noted that they have used circle process twice over the last week and think sheets once over this previous week. One of them also noted that they did not opt for a restorative process during a student conflict and admittedly utilized punitive methods, which we will see represented in the following graph. Both social workers noted that they have found the materials and samples listed in the guidebook to be beneficial in guiding and structuring their approach to conflict this past week. Specifically, that's referencing the samples I provided for think sheets and letter writing. Both social workers did state that they would appreciate talking more thoroughly about applying practices to relevant case studies with the potential for role plays. So, although they feel as though the guidebook provides lots of resources and information on what each practice is and kind of the bones of those restorative approaches, they would like more opportunities to see how they would be applied and what it looks like to apply it in the midst of complex situations and nuanced student conflict. So that is the feedback that they gave. So, hypothesize client progress. So, here is the hypothesize, which we'll get into why this is not a specific and entirely representative graph of the benefits that we have seen. This is a hypothesized um, client progress graph. So, over here on the y-axis, we have comfortability with applying restorative practices in accordance with that Likert scale format of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 being extremely comfortable and 1 being extremely uncomfortable. And then days in school, 1 through 5 is the baseline collection that we completed pre-spring break. And then 6 through 10 is representative of this past week. Now that they've gotten to interact, the social workers have gotten to interact with the guidebook and have been able to utilize some restorative practices in student conflict. So the average that we saw within their baseline is that most of the time, the social workers, for the 5 different practices, restorative practices within the guidebook, they were familiar, they were comfortable, but only moderately. They weren't extremely comfortable in any way, or even somewhat comfortable at applying these practices since they were still new to them. However, they did not feel uncomfortable, whether that's somewhat or extremely uncomfortable. Then, um, as representative of what they stated, that they verbally stated that they have become more comfortable at implementing the practices. However, we're not reaching the 5s, the extremely comfortable, implementing the restorative practices because they don't necessarily know how they would apply to all case studies and situations. And this dip that we see around day 9, which is this past Thursday, we have one of the social workers stating that that is the day that they kind of reverted back to punitive measures because they didn't really know slash had the capacity to implement a restorative practice in that student conflict. So this is my chart. As for descriptive statistics, an important note is that the provided graph on the previous page was created to represent the qualitative benefits that were described by both the social workers, as the quantitative data will be collected once the intervention has been completed in conjunction with an A-B design. So I'm doing that baseline test as an A, and then applying the intervention, and then testing again to see as a B to see if there has been change over time. The graph shows that both social workers have shown an increase in comfortability with applying restorative justice practices through applying them over the last week in accordance with guidebook resources and recommendations. The variance in the graph, that dip in the graph, indicates a return to punitive discipline, followed by a return to comfortability in implementing restorative practices. The small progress that we see, just the wavering from 3 to 4s, is indicative of a lack of familiarity with the nuance of each practice and an increased need for discussion on practical implementation to make sure that we get to the extremely comfortable category. Hypothesis testing statistics. So, given the information that both social workers have provided, confirms that after the completion of the intervention, my hypothesis will be valid. A refresher on my hypothesis is as follows. Providing school social workers with a guidebook on how to implement restorative practices alongside 4 debriefing sessions will increase social worker familiarity and comfortability with implementing the practices mentioned in the guidebook. Both social workers stated that they had utilized the guidebook as a tool for implementing restorative practices over the past week. One stated that they had utilized the sample of a think sheet as a guide to prompt student reflection. So not only are they just referencing the guidebook as a theoretical a theoretical resource and also information on how to apply it. They're also utilizing the samples that I provided as well. However, both have also noted that they need increased insight on the specifics of how to apply each of the interventions, which parallels the empirical gaps in the practical application of restorative practice. So, back in my literature review, this particular reference that I have listed here noted that a lot of our restorative theory research is just that. It's on theory, it's not on restorative practices. And so, a lot of times, our restorative practices either aren't specific on how to apply them or they lack theoretical grounding. So the fact that the social workers are calling for more specific ways to apply these interventions directly parallels what these researchers are stating is lacking within the literature. So in response to this information, what is my approach? So, the benefits that the guidebook has brought about, alongside the need for increased specificity, equally influence my continued intervention approach. So, what I will continue to do, we will continue social work interaction with the guidebook as a tool and resource to utilize in addressing student conflict. And part of why I provided a guidebook in addition to the debriefing sessions is that the guidebook is something that the social workers can reference outside of those sessions, outside of notes. And it has readability and is able to be pulled up either digitally or also on a print version that I provided to them. So very accessible in utilizing that as a tool and a resource. Additionally, we will continue meeting in person, or as I said, interacting with a virtual discussion if necessary, if we aren't able to meet during our prep time, to talk about practical implementation and case applications. So, once again, contextualizing what those restorative practices look like in actual scenarios that apply to the social worker's needs. What will be modified given what the social workers have provided, information-wise, increased discussion of relevant case studies or students that social workers are working with to contextualize applying restorative practices, potential for role plays of various approaches for social workers to have practice not only implementing each approach, but also having increased understanding of what it is like to be on the receiving end of a practice. So, part of that benefit of role plays is not only do we have the experience under our belt of what phrasing are we using, how are we saying the things that we are, how are we leading somebody else through this practice, in the role plays, we can also act as the student or family member or staff or whoever it may be that's being encouraged to participate in this practice. We get to be on the receiving end of that and see what lands, what doesn't, and see what is helpful to say within those situations and how it could be beneficial. So, what did I learn from this activity? For some practices, the guidebook has been sufficient in providing insight into practice application due to the use of samples. So that's specifically think sheets and letter writing. Due to the autonomous nature of these things, with think sheets prepping the students' own personal reflection before they engage in conversation, and letter writing being an independent student activity, the fact that there is a use of or a providing of samples within the guidebook has been said by both social workers that it is sufficient in providing insight into how do you implement think sheets? How do you implement letter writing? So you implement it through using things like these samples and through applying it with students. Other practices that involve conversations between peers and group facilitation require more specificity and practice on how to implement the approach in a variety of settings and circumstances. So those are our remaining three practices, which is circle process, restorative reentry, and peer mediation. So the goal is providing tangible steps to a fluid practice, right? So we are not giving a step-by-step list on how we need to complete circle process and how we need to conduct a restorative reentry. Because each student is unique and each circumstance is unique, that is unethical to say that this exact phrasing of this exact question in this exact way is going to reap the same benefits for one student as it is for another. Instead, utilizing the application um, to case studies and student circumstances allows for the practice's fluidity to meet a structured approach. So basically, yes, we recognize that circle process, restorative reentry, and peer mediation are very fluid processes. And there is kind of this restorative theory that's backing it. We also want to have a structured approach of knowing here are 5 phrases I could say that all draw attention to the same thing, but are going to be more applicable to one student than another. And just making sure that we have the resources to not only um, effectively apply the restorative practice, but also adapt it to meet student needs, to make it a fluid practice, to make sure we're not just reading off of a script. And that comes with practice, and that comes with case studies and relevant application to relevant circumstances. So, what challenges did I encounter? The main challenges I encountered were having qualitative statements reporting client progress as opposed to quantitative data. So, part of that is attributed to taking only a pre-intervention baseline collection and a post-intervention baseline collection. So, I'm not collecting data in the in-between portion. Um, and my next point speaks to that. So, quantitative data collection between the baseline and post-intervention not being applicable because um, it is the chance to apply restorative practices is highly contingent on student behavior and opportunities to apply those practices. And also, as I speak to in the next couple points, the length of time that we have had to apply this intervention. They've only been able to utilize restorative practices with the guidebook for 1 week, which, given that the length of the intervention is only 2 weeks, hasn't been enough time to be able to effectively say whether or not there has been benefits the um, from the guidebook. So collecting quantitative data, kind of that hard data, as opposed to qualitative data during this in-between period just wasn't as applicable. Also, the limited time frame of the course, like I said, there's less time to apply and analyze the intervention, which has made it difficult to be able to find that quantitative data with marked increases or marked decreases, or just significance within the different data points. Additionally, the specific things that I'm measuring within my project of comfortability and familiarity with these restorative practices, those are both circumstances and factors that take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to be comfortable implementing a practice and familiar with a practice. So to only have a couple weeks of implementing this intervention and applying it with my clients has been tricky in being able to accurately state that their comfortability is attributed to the guidebook. Because, like I said, comfortability and familiarity are things that are reliant on time and having time to practice. So, here is my reference. And thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video.